All right, so this is Eric Baker from the Dade City Wire. I'm here with Mr. Bill Dayton, longtime resident of Dade City. So, Mr. Bill Dayton, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, as I mentioned a little earlier, I was born here, and I went to the Dade City Grammar School, and then, well, they didn't call it middle school then, and then I went to St. Leo Prep, starting in the 8th grade, and I graduated from St. Leo in the prep school, and then went to Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, and I also went to law school at Mercer.
So you're a lawyer. You're a practicing lawyer then.
Well, I'm retired now. I closed my office a few years ago, and I've not been in active practice for a while.
So, what kind of law did you used to practice?
General practice. You know, I did, especially toward the end, I was primarily doing criminal defense law and real estate and probate. For years I did family law as well, and I got out of that when the Supreme Court adopted their standard interrogatories, which work for people with a great deal of money, but it made it, when they're required, and you're dealing with a client who doesn't have a stock portfolio, and you're questioning him about a stock portfolio. Got half a dozen questions about their stock portfolios, and some of my clients would not have any idea what that was. And so I'd have to explain it, and that would mean that I had to spend a whole lot of unnecessary time with low-income family law clients. There was one kind of gratifying occasion in my family law practice. A young man from Lacucci hired me to get him visitation with his children. He and his ex-wife were not on good terms, which certainly isn't uncommon in family law. And I was able to get a court order that he could see his kids again. And his father told me, Bill, this is the first time that any member of my family ever hired a member of yours. My grandfather never forgave your uncle for introducing the bill that ended free range.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, Florida was a free-range state up until the late 1940s. And when my late Uncle George Dayton was in the Florida legislature in the late 40s and early 50s, one of his accomplishments was introducing the bill that ended free range. Up until then, if you didn't want someone's cattle or hogs in your yard, you needed to fence them out. And Dade City had a fence and cattle gaps all around the city limits. I grew up on Tank Hill, and our yard was the backyard boundary, and the west boundary of the yard were the city limits. And I can remember the cattle gaps. After a heavy rain, dirt would wash down and fill up the cattle gap, and if the city didn't get somebody out there to dig the sand out, all of a sudden you had somebody's cattle wandering into the yard and grazing And I don't think there are any of the cattle gaps left,
Mm.
but there was one next door that had just been filled in, but you could see the iron rails that made
Yeah.
the cattle gap, and uh, but that somebody who didn't know what it was just dug it up and got rid of it. Uh, that was kind of sad that just it was the last one, but the yard was fenced and there was a cattle gap where the driveway came in. There was another one of those on Church Street, but I believe it's also gone.
Mm. Okay, and so now you told me you're born and raised right here in Dayton City.
Yes.
You're from Dayton City.
Yes.
And you said your grandfather moved here when he was
15. He was born in Texas. My great-grandfather was a medical doctor, University of Iowa, class of 1856. And he got tired of his whole career in medicine had been in the Wild West. And he got tired of having mysterious men in dusters wake him up in the middle of the night wanting him to patch bullet wounds and ask no questions. And in return for the medical assistance, they wouldn't burn down his house. And he got kind of tired of that and decided to move to Florida and stop practicing medicine. People found out he was a doctor, and he wound up being back in the practice of medicine anyway. But he had been a successful rancher in Texas and sold his Texas property. There was a story told in the family that I always assumed to be a joke, probably manufactured either by my grandfather or by my father or my uncle or all three of them together. The story being that great-grandfather Dayton had to sell the ranch in Texas because water or oil kept filming over the water holes and the cattle wouldn't drink it. And he so moved to Florida. I'd always assumed that story was false. And then some years ago, a friend of mine who worked in the library at St. Leo called and said, "Bill, there's some interesting magazines." Somebody gave us a bunch of antique magazines from the first few years of the 20th century. And I thought you'd like to take a look at them. And I came out and looked, and there was an ad for a company selling stock in an oil oil venture. And part of the ballyhoo for their stock was, "We have leases on 1,700 acres adjoining the famous Dayton's Prairie oil field." So, great-grandfather Dayton apparently did sell some prairie ranch land because he didn't realize that the oil was more valuable than the cattle.
Right.
He also, when he arrived in Tampa, was offered 10 acres in Tampa Heights for 10 horses. He had brought a string of Texas cow ponies with him. And when they were unloading in Tampa, somebody liked the horses and offered to trade him 10 acres in Tampa Heights
Hmm.
for the horses, and he turned it down because, having a scientific education, he knew that Tampa had no future as a residential community. There was just too much low ground, and as any scientist of that day knew, low ground caused miasmal vapors that caused malaria. The connection with the mosquito wasn't discovered until, I think, 1903. Although, oddly enough, in the 1850s, there had been a Dr. Wall in Tampa who published a paper in which he speculated that malaria might be carried by mosquitoes. And however, he later decided, no, that idea is a false lead, and he gave up on it. It wasn't until they were digging the Panama Canal that, I can't remember now the name of the doctor who was associated with the Panama Canal, who discovered that malaria was carried by mosquitoes. And that may help explain the old belief that malaria could be avoided by heavy drinking. And so, places like Cape Coast Castle in what's now Nigeria, the colonialists it was a slave trade base, Cape Coast Castle, and I'm told that the cemetery there is just full of young men who died very shortly after arrival in Africa from malaria.
Sure.
And that to try to prevent the malaria, they would drink huge quantities of gin. And so here, the staff of Cape Coast Castle was probably roaring drunk 24 hours a day, and thinking that that would help. And apparently it did. I've noticed sometimes when I have friends over here for cocktails and someone is not drinking, the mosquitoes will attack the non-drinker first. Invariably.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean they won't attack the drinkers shortly afterward.
Sure.
But that it does apparently dissuade mosquitoes for a limited amount of time. Well, I've been rambling. Are there any specific questions you'd want to ask me?
Sure. So, more specifically about Dade City. So you're from the area. So I'm just curious what you would have to say just about Dade City in general.
Well, Dade City has so far managed to avoid the unrestrained growth that has done so much damage to other parts of Pasco County. The reason US 19 is such a dangerous drive is because there were a whole bunch of subdivisions that were built out there that just would empty into 19. And the reason Zephyr Hills is surrounded by small trailer parks is that the original developers of Zephyr Hills, the Zephyr Hills Colony Company in 1910, developed it as a retirement community for veterans of the Union Army, the Grand Army of the Republic. And what's now the American Legion Hall in Zephyr Hills was originally the GAR Hall. And the colony company would sell a 5-acre tract and add a lot in town with it, so that the Union veteran could have his 5-acre retirement farm and a lot in the city of Zephyr Hills. And of course, as the original settlers died off, their heirs would sell the property and break up these small retirement farms. And if you look at a land ownership map, Zephyr Hills is surrounded by small mobile home parks. They're all on 5 acres or some multiple of 5.
Okay.
And yeah, that's how that evolved. And Dade City has always been insulated by large land holdings, cattle ranches and orange groves. Although that's disappearing now too.
What do you foresee as the future of Dade City?
Well, I frankly think some of these new subdivisions are the slums of tomorrow, and that it's not going to bode well. The state of Florida has beaten the drum for planned growth for many, many years now, and spends inordinate amount of money on plans, but the plans are obsolete before the ink is dry. Nobody tries to hold to the plan. We had one called Florida 2000, and the state of Florida spent millions and millions of dollars coming up with the Florida 2000 plan, which called for certain tracts of land to be restricted to agriculture. And you have a freeze, and the orange groves are not producing, and somebody wants to just get rid of the land and at the highest price, and so they allow a subdivision instead of requiring the property to stay in agriculture. And that has led to uncontrolled growth and houses that are just far too close together. And that's the result of nobody paying, the whole state paying huge amounts of money for these elaborate plans, and then nobody sticking to the plan. We still have a number of large land holdings surrounding Dade City. The Larkin family are still very active in agriculture of all sorts: cattle, citrus, soybeans. At one time, I had my office in the Larkin building when the late E.B. Larkin was still alive, and Mr. E.B. was a lawyer and also a cattleman and also a soybean farmer. And his older brother, Bill Larkin, brought the first Santa Gertrudis bull to Florida. That was a story, and they were all the Larkins were good friends of my family, and Mr. Bill Larkin went to Mexico, and on the way there stopped at the King Ranch in Texas, and he'd heard that the King brothers had developed a breed of cattle that did much better in tropical climate. You know, some breeds of beef cattle don't respond well to too much hot weather, and the Brahma bull and the Santa Gertrudis, which is a mixture of Brahma and some other breeds of cattle. Santa Gertrudis is very heat tolerant, and Bill Larkin looked at some of the Santa Gertrudis cattle and went and spoke with some of the King brothers about seeing if he could buy one, and they said, nope, we're not letting them off the property. We developed the breed and we're keeping it. And as he was leaving, he overheard some of the King's cowboys talking about they had run into a critical shortage of some particular grain. I don't remember now what it was, but it happened that Mr. Bill Larkin had a large quantity of it stockpiled, and so he went back in and spoke to the King brothers again and said, well, I understand you need so much of this grain. Well, yes. Do you have? Yes, I've got plenty, and I'm not going to sell it, but I'll trade it for a Santa Gertrudis bull. And so they worked out the deal, and Bill Larkin and his wife Emily and their friend the late Dorothy Locke, who was a pioneer, I think the first person in Pasco County to teach Spanish in the public school system. And so she acted as interpreter for the Larkins, and they, on the way back, they stopped and picked up the Santa Gertrudis bull, and the old Larkin house on Church Street, which is now inhabited by their nephew, who was raised by Bill and Emily, the Ray Battle. And I can remember when the pen in the backyard was still there, where they had put the first Santa Gertrudis cow in Florida, or bull, first Santa Gertrudis bull, in a pen in their backyard on Church Street. Excuse me.
Sure.
That's, the economics of the citrus industry over the years is kind of interesting. In the 1890s, when the railroads first came through, all of a sudden it was highly profitable to be raising oranges. And because you could, instead of having to pack them in barrels, haul them by ox cart into Tampa, and then ship them by schooner to New Orleans, and then get on rail lines, now you could load them right here, and they'd be in Boston or New York in a matter of days. And in the late 1880s and early 1890s, 10 cents a day was still considered a decent living wage. Later on, of course, it things changed. There's a story that I've always liked told about the Cummer sawmill in Lacoochee. The Cummer Company came to Pasco County in the early 1920s and developed the Cummer Mill there, and they bought the whole east end of Pasco County, which was the Green Swamp, and proceeded to remove the first growth cypress. And when the Cummer Mill first opened, there was a young man who got a job, and he was one of their big items were cypress crate parts for orange crates. And he was pushing a dolly full of crate parts around in the mill, and bumped into older, well-dressed, prosperous-looking gentleman and knocked him down. And the young man said, "Get out of the way, you old fool. Mr. Cummer ain't paying me 10 cents an hour to watch out for the likes of you." And he went on, and some people came rushing up, picked the old man up, and said, "Mr. Cummer, shall we find out who that is and fire him?" "Hell no, that's the kind of man I want to have working for me."
Yeah, that's a good story.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've heard it from a number of sources, all of whom said they knew the people involved.
Yeah.
There's a house that still stands in Lacoochee that was known as the Bungalow, and the Cummer family kept that as their residence in Lacoochee. And it had a gardener and a maid, and they would be ready to have breakfast on the table on very short notice. And sometimes I talked many years ago to the late Clifford Cooey, who was the station master in Trilby. And one time, one of the Cummers got off the station platform there, and he said, "Yeah, call the Bungalow and tell them not to fix breakfast for me. I'm going to go out and have breakfast with Johnny Mills." He was an old friend who lived just outside of Trilby on the other side of the Hernando line. And so Cooey called the Bungalow and said, "Yeah, Mr. Cummer says not to fix breakfast. He's going to have breakfast with Johnny Mills and his wife." But they, without that instruction, they would have had breakfast on the table waiting for him when he got there.
Yeah. Yeah.
When the Cummer Mill, and that was at one time the largest single employer in the county, and before Cummer, there had been Sunnybrook Tobacco Company in Dade City, which was, before Cummer came in, the largest employer in the county. And Sunnybrook had a disease called black shank spread through that wiped out 3 successive tobacco crops in succession. And losing 3 crops in a row was just more than Sunnybrook could handle, so they closed their doors. And fortunately, Cummer Company moved into the county just about the same time, the early 1920s. And Cummer didn't close until the late 1950s. And I'm told that Mr. Wellington Cummer made the comment, "Well, we just logged ourselves out of the cypress business." they're still out in the green swamp, which now belongs to Swiftmud, the Southwest Florida Water Management District. But out in the woods and swamps there, you can still see some of the railroad embankments. The rails and ties have been taken up long ago, but the embankments are still there. The Cummer Company had their own engines and would lay rail lines into different areas and then send crews of men out to cut the trees with crosscut saws and then pull them up using a thing called a steam skidder, pull them up to the rail line and load them on flat cars. And the Cummer trains, we've got one of them out at the Pioneer Museum that the Cummer Company gave the museum. And it's but they would bring them in. They were cutting cypress, some of which were so big that they couldn't get them into the mill, and had to have a specially trained crew of men to split the logs with dynamite.
Oh, wow.
And, of course, you have to be real knowledgeable to avoid to just split the log and not splinter it.
Yeah.
But the size of the virgin cypress, some of those things were just really immense. You can look at some of the old photographs and realize, my gosh, it would have taken 10 men at least, standing fingertip to fingertip to go around the base of the thing.
Sure.
And that one of the projects that my great uncle, whose name was George Dayton also, but they had different middle names. My great uncle, my grandfather's older brother, George William Dayton, was in the legislature in the early 1900s, I think about 1915, and he introduced a bill to set aside 200 acres of virgin pine forest so that future generations would be able to see what the virgin forest looked like. Nobody thought there was any need for anything like that. The bill died in committee. And there are now no virgin pine forest left. It's all been cut. There are a few, I remember as a child seeing one virgin pine tree out in Gulf Hammock. I went out there, I was, I guess, 10 or 11 years old, and my brother and I and were hunting with my father and an old friend of his, and he had some property in Gulf Hammock and had a virgin pine tree on it, which was immense. You can get an idea of how big some of the virgin trees locally were by looking at the pews, the older pews at St. Mary's Episcopal here in Dade City, and the older pews at St. Anthony's Church in San Antonio. These older pews have single board backs, one pine board 3 feet wide, and these are quarter sawn, not that's a really big tree to produce a
Mm-hmm.
3 foot quarter sawn board.
Sure. So, sir, what would you say? And one final question. I don't want to take up too much of your time. What would you say is a reason, or a few, or some of the top reasons that you love? What do you love the most about Dade City?
Well, again, I was born and raised here, so it's always been home. Yeah, just a feeling you kind of fall into. Uh, my friend Morgan Tyler, who was raised on military bases, uh, his father was an Air Force general, and his mother was local. She was a Hawes, and her parents lived across the street from my grandparents. And she told me at one time that I was a guest at Morgan's first birthday party. I would have been 2, maybe 2.5 at the time. And I have just a very, very dim recollection of going to a party at the house across the street from my grandparents and seeing more people my age than I had ever seen in one place before, and feeling kind of intimidated by it. And then recognizing some of the black helpers who were assisting the Hawes at the party, and recognize some of them. So, okay, everything's okay. I know where I am, and who's here. And the late Nudie Bell Richardson is the person I'm specifically remembering, and she worked for the late Dorothy Locke. And so, Dorothy Locke was a real close friend of my parents and my uncle and aunt, and the family were always close to my family. This house was built by Dorothy Locke's aunt, Miss Hetty Bell Spencer, who was the postmistress of Dade City for a long time. She was a McKinley appointee, and built this house in 1904. By that time, she had been postmistress for several years. She was in office as postmistress when Theodore Roosevelt took the post office out of the patronage system and made postmaster a merit retention job. And Miss Hetty had always done a very competent job as postmistress, so she stayed on into the 1930s. And she was the maid of honor at my grandparents' wedding in 1902. So, you see these family links over generations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
And now that Morgan has retired, he was a professional bridge player and then decided to get a graduate degree. He has a PhD from Harvard and is a leading authority on first century Palestine. But he moved back to Dade City, where his mother was born, and lives just down the street, and drops by here for a drink every now and then. And again, I've known Morgan since we were very little boys. Not, there's not any one thing that I'd point to as saying something I like. There are a lot of things I like about Dade City, and one of them is, having been here for a long time, and so I know a lot of people, and there's been a Dayton practicing, well, until I retired, there had been a Dayton practicing law in Dade City since 1895. My great uncle was a graduate of University of Michigan, and my grandfather read law in his older brother's office. My grandfather never went to law school, but in those days you could read law in an established lawyer's office, and then would be examined by a judge in open court and questioned in law and chancery. And we still had separate chancery courts in those days. That was a thing carried over from English common law, that originally the Court of Chancery was an ecclesiastical court, and the Lord Chancellor was the king's confessor. And when Henry VIII suppressed the monasteries and started the Church of England, the position of Lord Chancellor was no longer automatically held by an ecclesiastic, but since the original chancellor had also served as the king's confessor, it was the court of conscience. Things that were not permissible in strict law, you could appeal to the king's conscience through the chancellor. And for that reason, chancery court jurisdiction was primarily what's now called family law. And real estate was more absolute. Criminal law was pretty absolute. For one thing, until the 19th century, all felonies were punished by death. And so in England, a felony, a theft of something worth, I think, more than 3 shillings 6pence, that meant the death penalty.
Wow.
Yeah. And I read the story of an English judge, Lord Mansfield, who at a trial, someone had stolen a piece of clothing from a tailor's shop, and Lord Mansfield said, well, the value of this thing, I assume, is less than 3 shillings. And the tailor jumped, my lord, why, the fashion alone is worth more than that. I mean, it was a fashionably cut coat. And pray God, sir, we should not hang a man for fashion's sake. That was Lord Mansfield's answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's an interesting figure in English law. He's the one who one of my law teachers used to say, created commercial law ex proprio vigere.
Oh.
He saw there was an area that needed clarification, And so he talked with a lot of the leading merchants in London to find out how they handle things like, where does a sale take place? And he adopted the practices of the leading merchants and brought them into law. It's interesting that the Confederate Secretary of State, Judah Benjamin, who escaped somewhere through this area, he's the only Confederate cabinet member who was not captured. He had noticed that he was slowing President Davis and the other cabinet members down when first they left Richmond, intending to reestablish the Confederate government in what was called the Department of Trans-Mississippi. That's on the other side of the Mississippi. They were going to reestablish the Confederate government in Texas and keep the war going. And as they were traveling from Richmond to initially with Texas as the goal, they realized just a minute now this whole thing is over. We're not going to be successful. We just need to get out of the country. And Benjamin asked to go separately. He said, I've noticed I seem to be slowing you down, and Jefferson Davis wouldn't hear of it. No, we're not going to leave anybody behind. And Benjamin said, no, I think I can handle it better if I disguised myself. And he, a Confederate cavalry officer from Louisiana, Major Leroy, offered to stay with Benjamin. And so they disguised themselves as a French land buyer and his interpreter. And Benjamin would speak nothing but French, and Colonel Leroy would interpret for him. And so they went off in that disguise. He noticed that his trunks had his initials, JPB, in brass tacks on them. And so he adopted the name Jean-Pierre Bonfal. And so Monsieur Jean-Pierre Bonfal and his interpreter were traveling in a surrey. And the when the Union cavalry unit that captured Davis and the cabinet got there, they noticed that Benjamin was missing, but nobody connected the missing Mr. Benjamin with Monsieur Bonfal, the French land buyer, until it was too late, and they got into Florida, and they eventually had to abandon the disguise and eventually abandoned the surrey and were traveling on foot. And probably in Hernando County, they decided, we're hungry. Let's just risk the next farmhouse we came to. And okay, we'll do that. We'll just, if they turn out to be Unionists, we made a bad gamble. And as they were approaching the farmhouse, a parrot, apparently the inhabitants of the house just let the parrot fly around. The parrot knew where the bird seed was and wasn't going to fly away. And the parrot was there shouting, "Hurrah for Jeff! Hurrah for Jeff!" Jeff Davis. And this is a pro-Confederate farmhouse here. And So they went up and hid out there, and then Benjamin traveled. Major Leroy parted ways with him. They decided they would be safer traveling alone than together. And Benjamin passed somewhere through here and wound up at the Gamble Plantation in the Sarasota area, which is now a state park. It was established as a museum by the Daughters of the Confederacy, and they still own the building. And Benjamin was from there. He hid out there for a number of weeks, and then got passage with a Cuban Confederate, Captain Tresla, I believe his name was, and was able to leave Florida on Captain Tresla's boat and make it to Havana. And there he changed and took a ship from Havana to Nassau. Arrived in Nassau. The ship he was on hit a squall, and he arrived in Nassau in a leaky rowboat with two Bahamian sailors rowing. And they came ashore just outside of Nassau, and Benjamin got out, took off his money belt, which had gold coins in it, divided the gold coins between the two Bahamian sailors, and walked into Nassau with absolutely nothing. But he had friends in Nassau, and they arranged for a loan and got him passage to England, and he lived the rest of his life in England, became a lawyer, published a book, Benjamin on Sales, that's still consulted. And by the time he died, he was a Queen's Counsel.
Wow. Well, sir, that's awesome. I don't want to take up any more of your time. It's been about an hour.
Again, as you see, I get easily distracted by something. I started off talking about Dayton City and wound up with Judah Benjamin.
Well, that's all right. It all plays in together. That's okay. The purpose of the conversation was just to sit down with you, have you talk about Dade City a little bit, and that's what we've done. So I really appreciate your time.